Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fauscette. Each week, we interview experts in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. Our show today, when AI gives the wrong answer, optimizing the customer experience. I'm joined by Anuj Shah, founder and CEO of Averas AI. Anuj, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So why don't we just jump right into it? Could you give us a little background first? Tell us about yourself, a little intro, and then also tell us a little bit about Averas AI and what you're doing there.
Sure. So I'm the co-founder and CEO of Averas. Prior to this, I spent 25 years at the intersection of customer service, operations, and emerging technology, leading AI programs or emerging technology programs in highly regulated environments, mostly financial services. Um, the reason I started this is because in my last role, I was heading a large AI implementation at a financial services organization, and we noticed a gap in the marketplace. And I felt like if, with the amount of investment that we had, with the talented resources that we had, the regulated environment, if we were encountering that, almost every organization would be encountering that. And as a result of that, I thought that I could stand up a company to help solve that particular gap, to help implement AI at organizations. So what our platform does is it solves two core gaps that we found. One
Mhm.
is explainability, and the second is knowledge quality. So what we do is we take a company's data, and through that, we create a large amount of test cases to identify what it would look like if an organization implemented AI today.
Mm.
And we use that information to provide that organization a score and then a set of recommendations to improve the score. And then that gives them the ability to make decisions on whether they feel like they're ready or not, depending on their risk
Mhm.
tolerance. We also have a knowledge quality component because a good portion of improving scores that we found is the ability to identify, resolve, and retest knowledge quality issues at scale.
Mhm. Interesting. Well, so one of the things that I heard a lot, and I actually this week I was at both Oracle AI World and Salesforce Dreamforce, and of course, the more companies talk about agents and going into the agentic um, implementation, the more observability and transparency, the more important it becomes, right? Because you deploy autonomous things about your business that could do things on their own, and that certainly increases the risk of failure and or some data challenge, exposure, etc. So I'm just curious, like, and definitely, like, this was the topic of the week, right? I mean, both companies have gone all in on agentic. So could you walk me through typically what you've seen that goes wrong with this knowledge content infrastructure, that causes these systems to fail?
So I think the data is the most critical part of an AI implementation,
Mm.
agentic or otherwise. The data gives the agent an idea of how to act based on certain guardrails that have been set up. So if the data or the knowledge is wrong, the agent will start actually taking action upon incorrect information. So I think
Mm.
that's the most critical piece. Um, in this, I've seen a few patterns occur in terms of knowledge and content infrastructure. So one is the data just doesn't exist. So you interact with an agent and it basically says, I don't know, repeat your question.
Yep.
The second is the data exists, but it wasn't included in the data that the agent was trained on.
Mm.
So it looks very similar. It doesn't exist or it wasn't included, same situation. Um,
Mm.
it gets worse from there. So in certain situations, you can have, as you start to layer in more and more sources, you can have sources that conflict with each other. And
Mm.
when they conflict with each other, then the agent can make decisions on how to disambiguate those situations,
Yeah.
and it may not act in the way that you want it to. Um, it
Mm.
may actually. So another error is just going in to RAG is a big portion of this.
Yeah.
It may go and retrieve the wrong information if there's errors in the retrieval mechanism.
Mm.
Or at the end of RAG, if it's getting that information and then summarizing it back to the user or taking action upon that summarization, um, it may be doing that summarization incorrectly. So those are some of the basic things. Um, I think the other piece is organizations need to really think about whether this is internal or external, because that's going to really decide what type of information what type of
Mm.
information, access, etc. You're going to provide that autonomous agent. So
Mm.
internal agents will obviously act upon a completely different corpus of data and may have completely different access to ones that are external facing. So I think that's really critical, um,
Mm.
in determining, where to go in terms of agent implementations.
Mm. And I guess that varies quite a lot by industry too. I mean, if you're more highly regulated, or like in healthcare, if you have HIPAA, regulations that you have to meet with certain data, certain privacy issues, that must increase the risk in the companies that are in those highly regulated spaces.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the things too, I heard this week, and I've seen this on my own agents before, but it's not necessarily that the agent gives the wrong information because it had that information, but I've also seen it make up the wrong information, which if in a gap, I guess it's certainly a possibility, right?
Yeah.
So I do. It does sound like, and certainly we've said for a while that the data is the key to any successful implementation of AI, but it really is more to, especially in an external use case, the knowledge behind it. So do you have an example of a company that maybe, was using this new agentic technology, but their knowledge management content underpinning really sort of undermined their implementation? And obviously you don't have to share the name of the company, but
Yeah.
just an anecdote would be interesting, I think.
So we recently conducted a study with a large organization, and we found that their agent. So the first thing we did was identify what are their customers contacting them about. The second thing we did is what does it do based on that information? And the results
Mm.
were surprising. We found that it wasn't able to answer a significant amount of their customer questions that we sampled. And that's
Mm.
because the data simply didn't exist, so that the agent did not know what to do in those situations. So I thought that was interesting, and that's pretty important because customers are already wary
Mm.
of using agents, chatbots, etc. Um, in our experience, you get one chance to make a good impression. Customers are already biased
Mm.
against it. You make a bad impression the first time, customers usually don't come back. Utilization
Yeah.
typically drops, and the business case associated to these projects never gets realized. I think
Mm.
the other piece is if you start to take it one step further, depending on where you are on the risk curve, customers can ask why was in a billing situation, what seems like a simple billing situation, why was my payment marked late even though it was set on auto pay?
Right.
So the agent or the bot would need to know things like the billing cutoff, third party timing, and grace periods, and how all of those interact with each other. And this ends up being a pretty high risk, sensitive customer interaction where if you give the wrong answer, there's potential implications associated to it.
Mm.
So I'd say in those situations, being explicit as to what you want the agent to answer is going to be critical.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, so when you're talking companies, working with companies, how do you help them diagnose, what's broken in that content knowledge management system? And then, what are the most common patterns of dysfunction that you see, when you go into these companies?
Yeah. So the first thing we do is we take in a large amount of data. So we take in a lot of their operational data, think
Mm.
tickets, chats, call logs, um, and then we take their knowledge base, and then we identify what are their customers contacting them about, Against that, we identify how they've resolved the situation in their operational data, and we compare it to what it would look like if they implemented AI and how AI would respond.
Mhm.
And then across that, we evaluate performance. We compare the answers across the two, and we look at accuracy, hallucination percentage, knowledge quality, technical strength, and we provide that organization a score for every customer intent.
Mhm.
And what we then work with them to do is figure out which intents are working well, which intents are not working well. And then against the ones that are not working well, we give them a set of we automatically give them a set of recommendations on how to improve the score.
Mhm.
So I think in those situations, what we try to do is provide the level of transparency in an automated fashion at scale, and then give them a path to actually resolve some of those pieces. Um,
Mhm.
I think in terms of common dysfunctions that I've seen in that, um, a lot of it comes back to the content. So there could be situations where there's outdated or duplicative content, especially as you start to layer in multiple repositories. There's ambiguous steps with no clear resolution. There's exceptions that are in internal facing docs, but not in customer facing docs. So those never get surfaced.
Mhm.
And one that we see quite often is customers have assumptions on what information exists in what sources.
Mhm.
So as we go through this process, it's almost like peeling back the onion. They start with one source and they say all of our data is in this source, and then they're like, oh well, as they get the
Well,
results, yeah, as they get the results, well, we forgot to include this, we forgot to include this, and then we.
yeah.
The interesting thing is we can then layer on those additional sources, and then see if it's truly improving the score or it's not
Mhm.
improving the score. And these are things that are hard. They're hard to do at scale.
Yeah.
So that's really what the purpose of our platform is to really help organizations do this at scale and do this in a repeatable fashion. So they
Yeah.
have a baseline to start with, and then they can see how all of these things are either improving or potentially in certain cases hindering progress on the
Mhm.
path to production.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like at scale, even to know how to do that evaluation and come up with some sort of metric that you could, that would let you take action to correct things. That in itself is very difficult.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, the other thing that strikes me when I listen to the conversation about the customers, and I hear this from customers a lot as they're asking me about agentic and should we go, what should we do, that kind of thing, is that basis really for success underneath it really is that ability to build trust in the organization that what you're doing is credible, is going to actually provide the kind of outcomes that you want. So I would think this actually goes a long way towards helping those customers build that trust that lets them, deploy this across their organizations, wider maybe than they would otherwise.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, so there's a lot of, and we mentioned RAG, retrieval augmented generation before, and I know there's been a lot of focus on it in the AI space. So how does optimized content strategy differ from just using RAG on top of your existing documentation?
Yeah. So um, RAG helps get the right set of information from your corpus of data.
Mm.
The problem is, if it doesn't exist in your corpus of data, RAG will return nothing. So I think that's why going through that knowledge readiness and getting these insights as to where you are and are not ready is critical. What we help organizations do is identify where are their authoritative sources, and if there are multiple sources, helping come up with decision logic on which source to use when, and then are there exceptions to that rule that should be layered. So all of those pieces sort of help layer in the readiness component, and then once that corpus and that set of logic is sound, then layering RAG on top of that makes it a lot more effective.
Mm. Yeah, so it's a tool, but it's not a solution to that underlying problem. That's interesting. And the other piece of this too that strikes me is we talk a lot about, oh, it's AI, it's data. You got to have good quality data. Got to maintain that data. Got to get it, aggregated somehow. But what you're seeing is a step above that. It's that you need to know that the knowledge you need for that agent to make those decisions, to operate, to be able to help those customers, we need to know that that information is correct, not just the underlying data is there or whatever, but it's more of a completeness and an understanding that what you have is in fact enough for that agent to function in the role and with the goals that you want it to.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, so I know you've worked a lot with different kinds of AI. I mean, conversational AI, NLP, RPA, and of course generative AI. And so how have you seen this knowledge management challenge evolve? I mean, what makes it more critical in these generative and agentic systems than it was when we were just talking machine learning, for example?
Yeah. So uh, if I think of sort of the before generative AI wave, um, that was more deterministic. So you had a known set of inputs and outputs. And as a result of that, you can test your most common inputs, outputs, you
Mm,
can test a couple of edge cases, and you'd have a pretty good sense of where you are in terms of readiness.
yeah.
I think the challenge here is the set of inputs are unknown and the set of outputs are unknown.
Mm,
And the challenge with that is, well, the set of inputs are unknown because the inputs are being the language. I mean, you can ask anything at this point. So
right.
what you need to do is go through a significant amount of testing because the number of cases that you have to run through to identify, well, one, to solve your most commonly asked customer questions is pretty significant because there's
Mm,
different ways that customers can ask the same exact question. The second thing
mm,
is you'd want to guardrail which ones you don't want to answer. Um, and then the third is um, you'd want to yeah um, you'd want to go through a significant amount of testing because
mm,
the outputs themselves can differ. So if you ask the same question twice, you might actually get a different
mm,
answer. So it's
mm,
really getting that corpus of data and a significant amount of data and really testing at scale. That's really important because of the amount of variations that this can produce.
mm.
You need to kind of go through a significant amount of iterations.
Hmm. I mean, it's almost like the in the old world, machine learning and neural nets, that sort of thing. We had a situation where it was truly an algorithm. It was deterministic, right? We knew what the inputs were, and based on those inputs, you'd get an output that's predictable. And now you're deploying systems that have the capability to make their own decision out of that input, and even learn from that. So if it's not correct, the output actually could create more downstream problems, and even with other agents that are connected in an 8A protocol or whatever, to teach you could actually teach your agents the wrong thing, not just one agent, but like a whole group of agents. So
Exactly.
it seems like the risk is just much larger than it would have been in the past.
Yeah. It's the risk and the variations are significant, especially
Mm,
as you get the situation where you ask the same question and you can get two different answers. Um,
mm,
those are situations, especially depending on where you are in terms of the risk of the intent that's being asked. Those end up being pretty significant.
mm. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, so when you talk to a CTO or even the customer experience leader in a business, and they're disappointed with their deployment, what's that conversation like? I mean, what are they usually aware that the information, the knowledge management, the content is the issue, or do they like want to blame the model or maybe the prompt engineering or other parts of the technology versus that information picture?
Yeah. It really varies by organization. Some organizations think that AI will mask a lot of the data quality problems, and then some
Mm,
organizations are really advanced. I think typically the way the conversation goes is there's some sort of there's some sort of question about can the model or prompt can we solve this through enhancing the model or using a different model or changing our set of prompts, And what we really try to do is go through and show them the output of the diagnostics. So we show them, here's what a good answer looks like. Here's what the model's producing. And then we go through the steps on how the model came to that answer. So we go through every element of
Mm.
RAG, for example, and show them, here's the data that was picked up, here's the set of documents, here's how it was summarized, and here's how it compares to the reference answer. And then once we go through a few of those iterations, the conversation quickly shifts from the model or the prompts, and then it quickly shifts to, we have to fix our data especially for our high volume intents.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's easy to think about this as technology, but if you're really rolling out this agentic system, it really is a hybrid workforce. Or you've got a digital worker, you've got a human worker, and you've got to figure out the method to get both of those the right information at the right time and in the right context, and that's not easy.
Yeah.
I think the other thing too is that, I see a lot of companies that have focused on aggregating their data or getting access to their data. Maybe it's zero copy or whatever, but they have, they've focused on that data, but they haven't really looked at the outputs from the agent in a way that says, here, did this solve this problem? Did it answer this question? Because that's a little bit downstream, and doing that up front has to really help you in the way you're implementing and the way you go forward with this to build much more trust and credibility in the system, right?
Yeah.
So I've heard you say turning fragmented content into strategic assets. So what does that really look like? I mean, could you walk us through a before and after scenario so we could get a better picture for what that means?
Um, Organizations have a lot of data. They have a
Mhm.
lot of data in completely different formats, some structured, some unstructured. In the age of AI, tapping into that data is really the thing that fuels the performance.
Mm.
So the challenge is, which data do you tap into? How does that affect results? Um, and then figuring out if you want to tap into a whole data set, portions of a data set. Those are really critical things that need to be answered,
Mm.
and thinking about which ones you want customer facing versus internal
Sure.
facing. Those are really critical decisions that have to be made as you go through this process. So in the current state, um, knowledge is scattered across multiple different spaces. You have shared drives, Slack, um, you have repositories, all over the place. Um, in an ideal world, what you would do is you would figure out what customers are asking about, and you'd figure out the authoritative sources to go and get that information.
Sure.
And if you need to pull in additional information, what you want to do is make sure that those things, anytime you add additional information to this process, you have the potential for adding additional context that then conflicts with the
Mm.
original data that you started with. So imagine asking a
Mm.
billing question. You have the answer in two different places. You start with the first place, it gives you an answer that you're happy with. Then you layer in the second piece of data source, and now you have a completely different answer. And the
Mm.
bot pulls from that. Um,
Mm.
what you really want to do is go through and understand what those intents are, and then really make sure that the AI knows exactly which one to pull from, so that you don't have those ambiguous situations where it may seem like a hallucination. It may actually just combine the two answers together and fabricate a completely different answer. Um, it's really going through a lot of those situations at scale, and then making sure that you're getting to a level that you're comfortable with
Mm.
before deploying, especially in high sensitive customers facing situations.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned guardrails before, and I think this is an important piece too, because if you think about those basic guardrails when you're putting the system together, it would be much more effective in your scenario of having the actual test data that shows, here's where I'm good, here's where I have some gray area, and here's where I have some risk or higher risk. So I should, in fact, build guardrails around those things. So that data driven decision making on how you deploy the system must be really powerful with your customers.
Yeah. I mean, the conversation that we've had with customers is a lot of customers want to just overlay AI on top of existing repositories and
Yeah,
think that the answers will just come. And it will pull information. I mean, it will pull information from multiple different sources, but
sure.
then it could have unintended consequences in a lot of the
Mhm.
examples that we went through.
Yeah. Yeah, and that really is that, difference in the probabilistic and deterministic answers, right? Guardrails, you want certain things to be deterministic, but then for the agent to truly be agentic, it needs that capability to perceive, plan, act, learn, right? That's that whole cycle. So it's the combination of the two. And I think sometimes people, companies, when they look at this, they think, oh, I have all these autonomous agents that are going to be deployed. Um, but autonomy's not a binary question, right? It's a scale. So there's some amount of autonomy, of course, but you may limit that based on those testing and output data. And then maybe over time that could even change, right? Because maybe you do build up a corpus of knowledge that's different that does lead to the right outcome. And with this test case capability, you could, in fact, iterate on that and find out if it's performing correctly.
Yeah. I mean, what we try to work with organizations to do is identify which ones they're doing well on and which ones they're not doing
Mm,
well on, and deploy a small amount that they're doing really well on to sort of lay the foundation and think of it more as an
mm,
iterative approach to AI development versus, trying to just release the AI agent and let it answer everything without any sort of guardrails.
right. Yeah, interesting. Well, I mean, you mentioned all the different data sources, and I think even just in my company, just trying to figure out where everything is sometimes can be really challenging. I mean, I have at least three different note taking apps, and you've got Google Docs, and maybe you've got Word docs and PDFs, and even some tribal knowledge that's stuck in your employees' heads. I mean, where do you start? If I'm a new customer and I'm trying to think this through and I want to deploy this system, particularly in a customer facing environment, what where's the beginning point, and what kinds of things should I be thinking about when I do have this messy information environment?
Yeah. So I think the first thing we try to start with is, what are customers contacting you about? So starting from a customer
Mm,
first lens, and then figuring out how you are doing relative to those. So we've got a scoring mechanism that can help with that. So we
mm,
establish a baseline of scores against customer needs. And then what we do is we go through and diagnose automatically
mm,
how that organization is doing against those customer needs. And what are things that it needs to do to improve the score? Are there knowledge base changes that need to be made, or do we need to pull in additional knowledge bases? Do we
mm,
need to check elements of the RAG pipeline? Um, all of those are different breakpoints in the process, and as a
mm,
result of that, that's what could pull down a score. So we go through and we diagnose all of that. We provide recommendations to help improve the score. We work through the organization to fix the highest volume ones and then retest to make sure that it's getting to the level of improvement that they expect. And then it's a risk-based decision as to when, what the right set of
mm,
thresholds are that you need to deploy something into production.
mm. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it really is establishing that baseline, and it's contextual to the companies and the use case, right? I mean, in a employee use case could be very different than what you'd want in a customer use case, or if you're in healthcare, a patient use case, that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Um, that makes sense. And having the data actually to make those decisions, a lot of companies just simply don't have that available when they're looking at it right now.
Yeah. I mean, one of the biggest constraints that I've seen organizations have is like the capacity to, one, come up with that corpus of data, because a lot of
Mm,
organizations do it manually and it's really hard to do. I mean, we do this across like almost a year's worth of data. So it's really
mm,
hard to do that for organizations, especially at
yeah.
larger scales. And then you need the ability to not only understand those customer needs, group them together, but you also need to do a comparison. You need to define what good looks like and then do a comparison of what
Mm,
AI is doing against what good looks like. And then
mm,
trace where there's mismatches, trace where the mismatch is coming from, and then solving that and restarting that cycle again. It's really
mm.
hard to do at scale.
Yeah. Yeah, that's got to be one of the biggest challenges for especially for larger companies where, and especially in the world of cloud where small solutions have proliferated across the business. I know I was talking to a CMO the other day, and I asked him about, marketing solutions. And once I got him thinking about it, he realized that, over time he'd built up like 33 different
Yeah,
marketing technologies that had their own database, and
yeah,
all that knowledge is siloed. And yeah, so that must be that's a nightmare. That is
yeah,
definitely a nightmare.
exactly.
So let's pull out the crystal ball for a minute. If we're looking ahead a little bit, I mean, obviously with agentic, we're going to see over time companies progress to more autonomous use cases and activities. The agents are going to handle more complexity. So how do the knowledge management challenges change, and what should companies be thinking about now that they're probably not?
Um, I think companies, again, depending on the level of maturity, um,
Mm,
these are still you still want to think of these as controlled agents. So you still have to draw out a couple of different steps in the process, and then really
mm,
give that agent um, guardrails on what it should and should not do, and then how does it make those decisions based on certain pieces of your company's information.
mm,
A lot of that is still there. It's still brittle. I mean, you can construct. I always say that there's the proof of concept, and then there's a production solution.
mm,
And the proof of concept, where a lot of organizations are in the experimentation phase, those are easy. I mean, we've been able to stand up proof of concepts in a matter of anywhere from hours to days. Those are not, especially in today's environment, those are not that hard to stand up. But getting from something that works on
mm,
a small number of test cases to something that works at scale, there is a significant amount of work involved in getting from
yeah,
A to B. Um, and I think knowledge is a critical component to it. There's the guardrails and all of the technical infrastructure, obviously, but I mean, I'm a big believer in garbage in, garbage out. And in the AI, and I heard this quote where in the age of AI, now that's changing to garbage in, garbage everywhere.
yeah, that's the truth. I like it. I like it. I mean, especially in a world where the agents learn and then teach each other,
Yeah,
you could create a true nightmare with that one.
yeah, exactly.
Amazing. Well, so Anuj, that's really all the time we have today. But great conversation and really interesting, and definitely an area that I think more and more companies are going to have to focus on as we go forward into this. Because again, deployment really does have to be based on trust and observability and transparency, and making sure that you're making those deployment decisions based on real data, not on some simple use case test that works in the lab but doesn't work in the real world, to kind of a situation. So that's great. But one of the things that I always do before the end of the show, though, I like to ask the guests for some sort of recommendation. It could be a person, a blog, a thought leader, whatever that you think would be valuable, or even just resources that that the audience could use to help them understand, learn more about AI and AI in their environment. So, what would you suggest to the audience?
I mean, I've used if I was starting out, there are a lot of resources now are now freely available from both the large foundational model providers. So you've got Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, et cetera. They have a lot of freely available training materials. There's a lot of good content that they've put out and training courses to go through. Um, there's obviously the influencers in those spaces that I follow for some of the
Sure.
more of the advanced pieces. I'd lead with two things. So one is, I found that the best way to learn is to try in a safe environment and try to incorporate a lot of AI capabilities into day to day life, and you'd be surprised how quickly you can start to adapt, and then realize
Mm,
how much it's changed and your perspectives evolved just simply based on that. I mean,
yeah.
my usage on AI has gone up exponentially as I've incorporated more and more into it. I'd say the second piece is the other question I get a lot is like, what's my perspective if I think 30 years or 40 years out? What does the world look like? And
Mhm.
I've heard a lot of different answers based on that. But I'm always the optimist in this situation. Um, and I think back to history, and I think of the major technological revolutions that have happened for centuries at this
Mhm.
point, right? We had the agricultural
Yeah.
revolution, the industrial revolution, and most recently you've had digital and mobile, or the internet, digital, mobile. Um, and the example that I give that was profound to me was my daughter was doing a research project for school, and I was telling her how we used to do research projects when I was in school. Like, I would have to get someone to take me to the library. I would have to get someone, or I would have to go to the card catalog, look
Yep.
for the book, find the book, make sure it wasn't checked out, hope it was the right book, find the answer.
Yeah.
If it wasn't, repeat that whole process again.
Yep.
Um, you're talking about a process that would take anywhere from weeks to or days to weeks.
Yeah.
Um, in this environment, she's able to look up information in seconds. I mean, she
Yeah.
asks AI and able to get instant answers. And I think that the result of that is going to be profound as you start to compound that over the
Yeah.
next, few decades, centuries. I think the world could look very different. I think the world could actually. I think that there's a lot of promise in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really exciting. I admit I also use a lot of AI tools in my research, and it has significantly changed and accelerated, my capabilities to understand topics and really be able to explain them to clients. So it's definitely exciting times.
Yeah,
Well, Anush, thanks so much for joining today. Really appreciate it, and really enjoyed the conversation.
great. Thanks for having me.
And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the show. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review to help others find us. For more research on AI and other software, check out arianresearch.com. If you're an expert in AI, generative AI, or business automation, either as a provider or an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arianresearch.com. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arian Research production. I'm Michael Fauscette, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.